Very welcome back from the break, everyone, welcome to the panel, Is the Private Political? It's my great pleasure to introduce this panel. I'm Dawn Herrera Helphand. I'm a graduate student, PhD candidate at the University of Chicago in social thought. And it was so exciting to be invited to moderate a panel on one of this question, which is one of the most contested and generative questions, I think, in all of Arendt's scholarship. I just wanted to offer a few thoughts by way of framing the panel today. In thinking with Arendt, I think it's important for us to remember that nothing is political a priori. And this gets us to some of the thematics that were coming out of the discussion in this morning's keynote. The account of politics she offers us, when it comes to content, is exceedingly thin. We hear almost nothing about what the stuff of politics is. Formally, on the other hand, it's exceedingly thick. And I'm sure that the requirements of appearance, of spontaneity, of newness, of this form of relationality will be familiar to most of us in this room. So, returning to the topic, in asking, is the private political, one of the things we're asking is how a political matter is constituted as such. What processes of making visible, of deliberation, of judgment, constitute private matters as matters of public interest? I want to pause on this word interest, right, which is one of, I think, the most profound metaphors in the human condition, and one of the best uses of philology that Arendt makes, right? The idea that the politics coalesces around a worldly interest, something that is between us, something that is interest, is, I think, exceedingly important to this question of how we should think the private in political terms. And I want to remind folks of the metaphor of the table, right? The interest as the table that both separates us and holds us together. It separates us in an articulate way, but it constitutes the object around which we gather. And so in asking, what is the private political, we're asking how something private, which definitionally takes its departure from hiddenness, from shelteredness, is put on the table before us in this public way. And with that, I'll begin by introducing Drucilla Cornell. Professor Cornell is Professor of Political Science, Comparative Literature, and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She has published widely on the topics of feminism, political and legal philosophy, ethics, deconstruction, and critical theory. Her two most recent books are The Mandate of Dignity with Nick Friedman and The Spirit of Revolution, Beyond the Dead Ends of Man with Stephen Seeley, which has got such an exciting title on it. She asked that I emphasize that she's the founder of the Ubuntu Project. Ubuntu is a system of relational ethics practiced in South Africa, where she is professor extraordinaire at the University of Pretoria.
Thank you very much, Roger, for putting this event together, and to you, Eva, for giving such a provocative paper. My talk today is called The Fragility of Persons and the Need for the Imaginary Domain. In my talk today, I will argue that embodied human beings demand many forms of so-called public support in order to engage in the project that I've called becoming a person. Privacy, both in Anglo-European philosophy and the jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court, has always turned on the notion of an individual as a given and the legal person as an expression of this idea of a self-contained subject inextricably tied to private property and literal spaces of retreat. Feminism is not anti-privacy in any simple sense. Instead, a feminist rethinking of what is of value in privacy demands that the entire discourse of the private and the public be entirely rethought, particularly because of the fragility of our lives as embodied human beings. In 1995, in a text called The Imaginary Domain, I argued that we need an entirely new political and ethical rhetoric to adequately defend crucial rights for which feminists have fought, and we never need it more than right now. Today I'm going to focus on the right to abortion, but obviously the struggles for reproductive rights include all struggles against any form of involuntary sterilization. But it's only one of many examples. I argue in that text, and I still hold to this position, that the imaginary domain is a moral, legal, and ethical space that embodied and sexuate beings need in order to play out their different personas. This domain enables us to be the source of our own imaginary and narratives of how we have embodied ourselves as sexuate beings who inevitably see themselves through an unconscious imago, which can endlessly be played with, re-performed, and ultimately re-narrated in the infinite project of becoming a person. Key to this argument is the idea that the person is not a given, but one that is a project which we pursue throughout our lives. This project demands at least 3 minimum conditions of individuation. They are as follows: bodily integrity. 2, access to symbolic forms sufficient to achieve linguistic skill, permitting the differentiation of oneself from others. And 3, the protection of the imaginary domain itself. These minimum conditions of individuation could turn us to a much more profound understanding of trans-individuality, as it has been particularly embodied in African philosophy. Unfortunately, it's beyond my brief remarks today to discuss trans-individuality, but I hope we will return to it in the discussion. For now, I want to continue my discussion of the way I use the word person. A person is what shines through a mask, even though the concept of the mask is the usual association made with the word persona, which in Latin literally means to shine through. For a person to be able to shine through, she must be able to imagine herself as a whole, even if she knows that she can never truly succeed in becoming a whole person, or indeed succeed at differentiating between the mask and the self. The equal worth of each one of us demands, as a matter of legal equality, the equivalent basis for the chance to transform ourselves into the individuated beings we think of as persons. The project of the imaginary domain is to synchronize the values of equality and freedom, and in a certain sense, to rethink what is of value in privacy. And I want to stop for a moment and focus on the word synchronization rather than reconciliation between freedom and equality. The great dream of big-picture liberal philosophy and jurisprudence, think for example of John Rawls' theory of justice, was to create a rational coherence between freedom and justice. Synchronization, on the other hand, recognizes that there are competing rights situations and deep tensions between values and ideals. The conflicts may be mediated and synchronized, but not eradicated. Synchronization recognizes the inevitable complexity of the modern state and the imperfection of all of our attempts to satisfy what we would call a rational theory of reconciliation, and that was John Rawls' big dream. This, however, is not to deny judgment, or that some ideals are better or worse, but as aesthetic ideals, and I will return to this shortly, they can only be judgment. There can never be a theory of reconciliation. The project of the imaginary domain, I said, is precisely then an aesthetic idea which seeks to synchronization. That the personal is political. A famous saying of the second wave of feminism, of course, is no way part of an anti-privacy movement. Rather, it's deeply rooted in the long history of how erotic transformation challenges to heteronormativity and vicious, misogynistic objection of the feminine other must always be part of radical and revolutionary transformation. Stephen Seeley and I have made that argument about how erotic transformation is integral to any meaningful revolution in the spirit of revolution beyond the dead ends of man. The imaginary domain, as a legal right, of course, would only be one aspect of such sweeping erotic transformation. But it does, as I will argue, allow us to defend the right to abortion on the basis of equality. Justice Blackmun, in his original decision in Roe v. Wade, found he faced a dilemma. He could not defend the right to abortion on the basis of privacy. And why was that the case? as most of our decisions, our being the United States Supreme Court, have defined privacy as the right to have a space in which the state has no business interfering. Equality was not possible for black men either, because under advanced equality jurisprudence, and it pretty much remained, turned on comparisons between men and women, and pregnancy was a real difference. And all attempts to find an equivalent condition in men, such as heart attacks or prostate cancer, seem to falter or be outright ridiculous. To quote Justice Blackmun, "The pregnant woman can't be isolated in her privacy. She carries an embryo and later a fetus, if one accepts the medical definitions of the developing young in the human uterus. The situation, therefore, is inherently different from marital intimacy or bedroom possession of obscene material or marriage or procreation or education with which Einstein, Griswold, Stanley, Loving, Skinner, and Pearson Meyer were respectively concerned." Blackmun has been criticized by the left and the right, and indeed the middle, for the incoherence of his decision. In fact, he did not have the jurisprudential resources to defend the right to abortion, and let me emphasize it too, because our Supreme Court, indeed our Constitution, has not been comfortable with imposing positive obligations on the part of the state. It's a very old Constitution. In the first trimester, the public nature of the abortion led the court to conclude the doctor in the process of a decision. In the second trimester, Blackmun realized that women might need much more extensive medical care. What is often forgotten in Blackmun's judgment is that the second trimester begins before any definition of viability, when the baby can supposedly live outside the mother's body. His primary concern was to provide effective health care for second trimester abortions. It was only in the third trimester that the state could weigh in, the interest of the infant against the right of the mother. Since fetuses are not persons under our constitutional jurisprudence, they do not have rights. A series of judgments following Roe, Webster, and Casey, the court allowed states to enjoin public facilities and employees from providing abortion. They did so on the basis that such restriction did not infringe on the women's right to choose. In the case of Casey, further restrictions were placed on how and under what conditions women could get even first trimester abortions, like you get all this literature about how you're a sinner and this type of thing. Of course, by 2017, the state's interest in protecting fetal life now goes all the way through pregnancy. The language of choice, of course, is completely inadequate, because if a woman is terminating an unwanted pregnancy, she obviously did not choose to get pregnant. Our bodies are not our own, and to avoid the horror of abortions done illegally in terrifying isolated conditions with medical equipment such as coat hangers, Blackmun knew that he had to provide women with actual material support, public support, in order for them to have safe abortions. The right to have an abortion obviously goes way beyond the notion of choice. And yet the critics are right that Blackmun's judgment falters into incoherence despite its creativity, precisely because privacy and gender equality jurisprudence could not give an adequate account of the right to abortion. But I would argue that the equal protection, to use legal language, of the minimum conditions of individuation would allow the right to abortion to be justified as a matter of equality. And in fact, in both Webster and Casey, Blackmun said that women needed to have insurance, welfare, Medicaid, Medicare provided to them, and that it was absolutely wrong to enjoin doctors and other employees or to give them the ability to not perform abortions, because the whole point of the second trimester was to make sure that women, not imagine fetuses, but women would actually have the access to abortion. Because what's the right of abortion? It's meaningless. I mean, you don't want to have a baby, you have to have an abortion and the baby has to come out of the uterus, right? I mean, so, this idea that you can choose to have an abortion and have no capacity to get an abortion is a deep and profound fantasy. And Blackman got that, and he had dissented throughout the rest of his life in every single case. In the text, The Imaginary Domain, I relied on Jacques Lacan to argue that the infant needs the mirroring of others in order to see himself or herself as whole. This projection of bodily integration is necessary to avoid psychosis, and as Lacan always tells us, the ego in the imaginary is a bodily ego. From the beginning, then, for a projected wholeness, the infant is dependent on others. It is only through the mirroring process that the infant comes to have an imagined bodily coherence. And yes, it is imagined, which is why we need the space of the imaginary domain. The body's coherence depends on the future anteriority of the projection of a self that's already there in the mirror. Instead, the self is constituted in and through the mirroring process, as other to its reality, a bodily disorganization, and does this by having itself mirrored by the other as whole. My brother just sent me a picture of one of his grandchildren, and the little girl is 7 months old, and she's pushing a little thing to help her walk. And her father is saying, "You're a walker, you're a walker, you're a walker, you're a walker." This is exactly Lacan's point. That, in fact, the child is not a walker, but the enthusiastic response of the dad was the kid having a big smile. And then my brother proudly writes, "I think she's going to be an early walker." Because she's doing so well with her push toy. The Lacanian account allows us to understand just how fragile the achievement of individuation is and why we so desperately need the protection of minimum conditions of individuation. The denial of the right to abortion should be understood as a serious symbolic assault on women's sense of self, precisely because it thwarts the projection of bodily integration and places a woman's body in the hands of the imagination of others, who would deny her coherence by separating her womb from herself. It's not an exaggeration, then, to say that the denial of the right to abortion can be understood as symbolic dismemberment of women's bodies. It's only the worst kind of masculine fantasy that wombs wander. The wrong, as I have described it, begins long before any woman is actually pregnant, as our bodies are taken away from our imagined projection of the meaning of our sexual being, and pregnancy becomes something terribly scary. My best friend, when she was 13, refused to dance with boys at dancing school. We didn't have very good sex education, because boys squirted something and she could get pregnant, and then she would have to drop out of school. And my grandmother had given me a book, so I explained that you could dance and it wouldn't necessarily squirt. And dancing was a safe activity. She didn't really believe me, but that's what I mean when I say, like, getting pregnant, and the women who disappeared in the senior year of high school, and you know what happened to Susie, you know. It was terrifying, right? But nobody really exactly understood the process and what we might do to avoid it. Because, like so many schools now, we didn't have sex education. Pregnancy is not like prostate cancer or heart attacks. It's a unique condition. But if we are to equally protect minimum conditions of individuation, then we can justify the right to abortion, and all the facilities need to support it on the basis of equality. The right to always demands that we recognize the public nature of the support we need, even if we are healthy, quote unquote, to have our imaginary domain protected, so that our sexual being and our other forms of primary identifications are ours to narrate, not the state's. This is also a basic matter of freedom, because in the case of abortion, that women are given the freedom of imagination to narrate the meaning of their own experience. Some feminists had difficulties with any woman who said they regretted their abortion or found it a tragic experience. In order to defend the right to choose, it seems that abortion has to be labeled a fairly trivial matter. But under the imaginary domain and bodily integrity, it's a woman who, as part of her right, has the ability to narrate her own imagined projection of the meaning of her bodily experience. I agree with Justice O'Connor that viability became a very incoherent standard for when the state's interest in the fetus could trump the women's right in Roe v. Wade. My response is that there's one coherent standard. I still hold this position today, and that is to recognize the right to abortion all the way through the cutting of the umbilical cord. Then the baby is truly outside of the woman's body. And what is the limit on the imaginary domain? It is what I call the degradation prohibition. Given the importance of freedom to play with and indeed to act out the persona of lived sexuality, I've tailored the degradation prohibition very narrowly. Someone is degraded when they are reduced to stereotypes of their sex and have imposed upon them objectified fantasies of their gender or sex, so they would not be viewed as worthy of equal citizenship or even the inclusion in the idea of humanity. The purpose of specifically tailoring the degradation prohibition in this way is to ally ourselves with rather than pit ourselves against those who insist on the right to break out of the closet and act up in public. It's a very different notion of offense, which was bothering a lot of analytic philosophers. What do you do if you walk into a restaurant and you're offended by gay men holding hands, and the gay men are offended by you being offended? Well, the answer is offense is an inadequate way to describe it. Nothing in the gay men holding hands means you can't eat in the restaurant. Nothing it means that you can't get married. Nothing it means that you don't have the right to vote. None of it means that you don't have the right to have children. So you're not degraded in any meaningful way. So get over yourself. On what basis did I then, and I do now, defend the imaginary domain and minimum conditions for individuation, and with it the degradation prohibition? I still think Lacan is helpful, but we could also get to the fragility of the human body and the need for public support for it through other intellectual heritages, such as African philosophy, as I suggested earlier, in the notion of trans-individuality. But how does one judge whether or not the imaginary domain is right? The answer is that it's an aesthetic idea in Kant's sense. Famously, Kant argues that the great ideas of reason cannot be known, but only configured, and therefore reflexive judgment on these ideals cannot have rules which tell us definitively what is right or wrong. The promise of the imaginary domain and minimum conditions of individuation was that they could synchronize the values of freedom and equality in the emotionally fraught sphere of life we call sex and sexual being. But it would always be applicable, as I've argued, to other forms of primary identification, such as language rights, which I defended Spanish language rights. Whether or not this synchronization has been achieved demands judgment as to whether justifying abortion in this way empowers women to give their own meaning to their abortion, to imagine their own bodies, and to represent their sex with joy within their difference. And I just want to finish with a note on the discussion around Ava's paper. On this way of thinking, there is no plurality for women unless they are allowed to be able to individuate themselves from the objectified fantasies imposed upon them on the state. So plurality is not something, I mean, I agree that Arendt doesn't take it for granted, but here I'm making a specific feminist intervention. Unless women have certain basic reproductive rights, there is not going to be a plurality. We are going to be lumped together into something that literally blocks our individuation. So in this sense, the feminists need to make very clear what is given and what is not given. And one of the things that is not given is personhood.
Next we have Lori Marso. She's the director of the Women and Gender Studies program and professor of political theory at Union College, whose work in modern feminist and political theory entails a broad focus on bodies, their political interpretations, and more recently, their media representations. Currently, she's at work on a book on feminist film, in particular the films of Chantal Akerman, Catherine Breillat, and Agnes Varda. And last year, she co-edited a volume entitled Politics, Theory, and Film, Critical Encounters with Lars von Trier and Bonnie Honig. Her new book, out now, or out this summer, is Politics with Beauvoir, Freedom in the Encounter, and it'll be published with Duke University Press.
Thank you. I have to stand up because I have just a few images for you. So I put my title there, which is called Birthing Feminist Freedom. Are there postures best suited for freedom? Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Operating Officer of Facebook and author of the book Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead, insists that to gain freedom, women must lean in. Young Asian American feminist comic Ali Wong rejects that posture. She says, "I don't want to lean in, I want to lie down." Ali Wong's stand-up comedy rejects the verticality of the stand-up routine. Taping her Netflix special while very visibly... Whoops, pregnant. How do I get to that slide? And our guy just walked out of the room. Yeah, sorry. It works now. Okay. There she is. Okay. Thanks, Roger. Just your getting up made that slide go. Yes, exactly. Taping her Netflix special while very visibly pregnant, Ali Wong riffs on the decidedly not politically correct idea that she's tricked her boyfriend into marrying her so she can stay at home to enjoy the luxury of lying down all day. Wong says that to lie down, eating bonbons and watching daytime television, that is the posture that expresses the freedom feminists desire. Ali Wong's tongue-in-cheek call to women to lie down made me think about the way we imagine posture and how comporting our bodies this way or that, alone or together, shapes the way we imagine freedom. Should feminists stand like men, lean into the corporate table, lie down on the daybed? Beginning with beginnings, at scenes of birth, my comments explore postures of birth as metaphor for postures of birthing feminist freedom. A quick Google search yields suggestions for several birthing postures. Some envisioned alone, standing up, lying down, on all fours, leaning into a bed, and some envisioned with others, leaning with, holding ropes, holding hands, to suggest in birth and in birthing freedom that we not stand, squat, or lean alone, but rather actively enlist support, immediately adds others, in addition to the mother, to the scene of birth. Yet, lest we forget, the mother is already, to borrow a phrase from Hannah Arendt, 2 in 1. The addition of even more begins to make for a crowd, or maybe it's an assembly. Is the birthing room suddenly a public space, and what would make it so? What will the baby, aptly named freedom, make possible? By starting with these questions about the postures of birthing practices, I follow Hannah Arendt's interest in natality, but question the divisions she so carefully crafted between private and public. To challenge Arendt's boundary drawing is not at all a new thing to do, and it's especially not a new feminist thing to do. Although the question of this conference, this panel asks, is the private political, it's more accurate, I think, to ask, how is the private political? As feminists have taught us, the distinction between private and the political is itself political. What is surprising to me when we think with Arendt about the body, labor, and natality is the fact that for Arendt, the newborn is the private thing, able to make the leap, as it were, into the public space of appearance, while the body and labor remain in private. Leaving aside for the moment how she's able to separate natality from labor and the body, and from the laboring body of the mother, thinking about this unlikely leap makes me wonder about what enables leaping. I want to ask how imagining the postures and movements of bodies, leaping or limping from private to public, alone or together, and from being prevented from making that transition, alone or together, affects the way we think about freedom in the public sphere and how we think, too, about appearance, so important to Arendt's theorization of freedom. In a recent book called Inclinations, Adriana Cavarero urges us to think about leaning in, but very differently than Sheryl Sandberg or Ali Wong do. Cavarero draws attention to the shortcomings, short-sightedness, sterility, not to mention the patriarchal leanings of the verticality, the height, and the uprightness of the man at the center of philosophy. Cavarero says that to incline means, quote, to bend, to lean down, and to lower, end quote. Tracing inclination into the history of philosophy, Cavarero leans toward Arendt and her comments on natality. Caballero admits this, quote, "Natality is perhaps the most original category of thought that Arendt gave to the 20th century," end quote. She adds, though, quote, "In Arendt's reflections, birth, rather than being a biological phenomenon, incorporating, for example, the processes of conception, pregnancy, and childbirth, is essentially a scenario, a given of human experience, a theme for the imaginary in much the same way that death has been a theme for philosophy." That was Caballero, end quote. Just as philosophy tends to clean the scenario of death from all marks of its embodiment and the often quite difficult process of dying, Arendt too abstracts from the phenomenology of birth to make political use of the concept of natality. Arendt leans away from the mother, ignoring her role in birth, an indispensable one, to instead focus on the newborn, specifically the appearance of the newborn. "A child has been born unto us," and she says it just that way. The passive voice makes us wonder exactly how that child got here, how the child made believe not only into the public sphere, but into the world. The mother cannot leap, nor can she appear. The same is true for any caregivers at the scene of birth, those who may have been supporting the mother, holding her hand, wiping the sweat produced by labor, as Drucilla already commented, from her brow. The baby, the one whose name is freedom, is curiously alone, even though Arendt tells us that it is this same baby who guarantees plurality. To ask these questions leads to more. What difference does focusing on posture, as I am doing, standing up, leaning in, lying down, or in this case, unsupported leaping, make for Arendt's version of freedom? Arendt insists that the newborn's appearance onto the scene of the world marks the unpredictability of beginning, celebrates the possibility of the new, and emphasizes plurality as the conditions that makes freedom with others the sine qua non of political life. If we, for a moment, agree that the newborn is not only unlikely but unable to leap from the private to the public, without the support of the mother and others, we should also agree that leaping is not likely the best metaphor for the posture of birthing freedom. A newborn cannot stand up without support, nor even raise her head. Challenging Arendt's boundary drawing, but following her direction, let's consider another birth scenario and other postures. Recall for a moment that Arendt is eager to use birth as metaphor, and that is already noted. She sees it specifically on the appearance of the newborn as a metaphor for plurality, beginning, unpredictability, politics, actions, and hence freedom. Judith Butler, another astute reader of Arendt, takes seriously Arendt's observation that to speak of appearance, we have to consider spectators. As Arendt knows so well, we appear to others, not alone to ourselves. And yet, Arendt refuses on principle to consider how our bodies appear as already saturated with political meanings. Whiteness, straightness, youth, able-bodiedness, maleness, or the deviations from these norms always situate and sometimes fully determine whether and how we can appear in public space and how we will be received. As feminist thinkers have long demonstrated, the first proclamation made about the newborn at the scene of birth, "It's a girl, it's a boy," is itself a politically charged declaration and sometimes a decision. For Simone de Beauvoir, who acknowledges the two-ness of pregnancy and birth, figuring freedom as a birth, already positions it as plurality. The mother is there to acknowledge the appearance of the child to acknowledge the mother. And there may be more, such as the hospital workers anxious to document the sex of the child. Adriana Caballero also acknowledges the presence of the mother, although not any other caretakers in the room, and she imagines the mother as inclined toward the infant in a caring arc. Caballero overly relies on the Christian imaginary of nativity to emphasize the child's original dependence on the mother. This is the painting that Caballero uses. Mary inclines forward with a protective gaze over her son. In this Christian imaginary, Christ shares his vulnerability and original dependence with humanity. But as Bonnie Honig demonstrates, however, to imagine this scene in this way obscures other scenes and other kinds of inclination. Speaking of sororal inclination in Antigone, Honig notices, quote, Antigone's whispered confidences to Ismene in the play's first scene and the sisters' conspiratorial collusions in their final scene together. Unwilling to obscure the agonism that is often intertwined with care, Honig says that at key points in Antigone, the sisters differ, argue, beseech, and forgive each other. Beauvoir is unwilling to separate care and agonism at the scene of birth, and she furthermore argues that the mother and the infant might react to each other in a variety of ways. She affords the newborn some agency and refuses to claim to already know the intentions and desires of every mother. Beauvoir says, for example, that the infant can turn away, refuse to nurse, make bonding difficult or even impossible. As the infant grows, the child is more than a mirror reflecting the mother's desire. As Beauvoir puts it, quote, "The mother can have her reasons for wanting a child, but she cannot give to this other, who tomorrow is going to be his own reasons d'etre. She engenders him in the generality of his body, not in the specificity of his existence." End quote. And for the mother, anything is possible too. Women who are reluctant mothers might find themselves charmed by their infants. Those who desired mothers ardently may feel the opposite. These conflicting and unpredictable feelings begin even in pregnancy, which is described by Beauvoir as, quote, "a drama playing itself out in the woman between her and herself. She experiences that as both an enrichment and a mutilation. The fetus is part of her body, and it is a parasite exploiting her." End quote. Will the baby become enemy, ally, or friend? The outcome depends on situation, ambiguity, and encounter. Beauvoir situates the infant neither as an autonomous actor, or a potentially autonomous actor like Arendt does, nor as a dependent extension of the mother, as Caballero does. For Beauvoir, the infant is an other whose desires and dreams can be denied or realized in freedom with the mother and others. Even with the mother, whether freedom will be enriched or denied depends on the two. In this case, the mother and the infant, what they make of it. As Beauvoir insists of every encounter, quote, "I can invent the most urgent appeals, try my best to charm, but the other remains free to respond to these appeals or not, no matter what I do." End quote. Thus, when we turn to the second sex, we see Beauvoir not only describing postures of birth, but also describing postures of birthing freedom. Especially important for Beauvoir is who exactly is on the scene for both events and how they react to each other. Encounters between actors might result in asking for, offering, providing, or withholding material forms of support. Mutual care or even sharing a direction are neither necessary or predestined outcomes of any encounter at the scene of birth, not even the encounter between mother and child. These embodied postures, the movements that create the in-between, as Arendt would put it, at the scene of birth as well as in the public sphere, mark encounters and their possibilities for producing, diminishing, denying, or enhancing conditions of freedom. By now, some of you might object to my characterization of various postures and possibilities at the scenes of birth, or object to my claim that this is itself a political space, or that it has a politics. But certainly we can see that it's not wholly private either. The postures of birth themselves have political histories. It's easier for often male doctors to deliver babies at a convenient time if they schedule cesarean births, and it might be more expensive to bring in a water pool to accommodate the posture of the so-called more natural delivery. I'm not, however, interested here in discussing the politics of birthing practice. Instead, I want to pluralize the metaphor to notice ways that the seemingly private or intimate spheres of our lives are structured and sometimes determined by political decisions and power dynamics. Noticing this, however, does not lead to the conclusion that we need not or simply cannot guard the realm of the personal from the intruding eye and the corrosive power of states and corporations when it's appropriate. I'm fully aware of Arendt's important warning that totalitarianism destroys the space of the private, a destruction that serves to isolate individuals and make meaningful actions nearly invisible. In other words, as Arendt rightly notices, under conditions of totalitarianism, the attempt is to eliminate not just the public, but also the private, in an effort to eradicate the appearance of some. Drawing a strict boundary between the two, however, I think is a misguided way to preserve both. What I'm doing here speaks to Arendt's anxieties about appearance by noticing the way politics conditions and makes possible any appearance at all, even in so-called private and intimate spaces. I've been exploring how and why even the scene of birth is a space of appearance, and how and why the postures of birth are important metaphors for how we think about freedom. When we recognize private spaces as potentially political spaces, we have to acknowledge the many political roles, not only that individuals, the ones that Arendt makes invisible, like mothers, caretakers, and doctors, but also that the state can play. The state can recognize family violence. The state can redefine or define marriage. The state might provide daycare and healthcare service. The state might decide to sterilize certain populations. Or the state might, as we're warned by Wendy Brown's early work, become a too willing partner with feminists, one that defines pornography in ways that assume and attempts to fix the desires of women. But we also do well to remember this. And we're reminded of this by Bonnie Honig's new book, Public Thing, and Wendy Brown's recent Undoing the Demos. We can defend what the state can do for it, and we should defend what the state can do for us, and we should enlist the state in certain situations. Thinking about the private with feminists, we can more readily see political encounters, including those where the state is involved, perhaps even especially so, that affect the birth of freedom. Arendt's unwillingness to do so, I think, makes these conversations less likely. One of these conversations that will not happen if we follow Arendt in her depiction of the newborn is how the scene of birth is embodied, shared by more than one, and always affected by state intervention. To make these conversations possible, I contest Arendt's depiction of the newborn as alone, as unmarked by bodily characteristics, and as able to leap alone from private to public. To use the newborn the way Arendt does, as a metaphor for spontaneity, novelty, and plurality, denies the role of others, in particular the mother, and postures of encounter between actors in the state, that serve to situate the birth of freedom. But although I challenge Arendt on the postures of birth and their implications for birthing freedom, I'm drawn to the depiction of her posture in another register. In Margaret von Trotte's film Hannah Arendt, Arendt is often shown lying down, on a daybed no less. She's not eating bonbons and watching daytime television. She is smoking and thinking. Thinking she is with others who are absent, but whom she brings to mind. There's a constant conversation going on in Arendt's head, one that is impossible for a camera to capture. For Honig, Arendt's couch becomes a scene for psychoanalysis as well as a scene for thinking. But I see it differently. For me, it becomes a scene for noticing how Arendt theorizes the two in one as disembodied thinking versus Beauvoir's pregnant body. But this scene may offer even more possibilities. Moving postures of birth into a space of public judgment and scrutiny, feminists such as myself follow Arendt's lead on matters of thinking and judgment as she lies on her daybed. Here's the real Arendt, also inclining. Arendt tells us that thinking brings to mind things or people that do not appear, that when we think of these things and people, we can move them from the realm of settled knowledge into the space of appearance where judgments can be rendered. This is a brilliant explanation of how the personal or the private becomes political. As Linda Zerilli explains in her recently published A Democratic Theory of Judgment, for Arendt, getting objects into view as objects, to be collectively judged, is part of what itself is political for Arendt. It is not that the objects themselves need be already determined to be political objects. And, as Bonnie Honig also shows, the objects can do a lot more than serve as a site for judgment too. Drawing Arendt and Winnicott, Honig argues that public things are shaper and sources of our capacity to care for the world. When we query the scene of birth, asking who is there, what is their posture, what are the possibilities and meanings of their encounters on this scene, and how do these, even the objects, affect the birth of freedom, what we are doing is a kind of feminist care for the world that asks how the private is political. This becomes, via this questioning and via thinking, a political space for the birth of freedom. That Arendt produces this process in her head, lying down on a daybed, makes me revisit Ali Wong's suggestion that lying down is the posture that best expresses feminist freedom. But I can't leave it at that. Ali Wong's comedic punch relies on the irony that instead of tricking her boyfriend into working full-time so that she can lie down, she's standing up doing comedy while 8 months pregnant. Maybe there's not just one posture for birthing freedom, or there are different postures for different moments. As Wong says at the beginning of her routine, what is surprising is her very pregnant self doing stand-up. So in this case, Contra Caballero, standing up is the radical thing to do. We might conclude that there is not only always more behind the scenes, so to speak, but also that different moments call for different postures. Leaping babies extracted from the scene of birth cannot always and everywhere signify freedom. Let's return to Arendt lying down on her couch. There is more behind this scene too. Here, lying down becomes radical, even though some things are hidden from view. In other scenes of von Trotte's film, we see that Arendt is unable to be alone, thinking in a reclining position on her daybed because of the care of others, not least of all the interventions of her female friends on her behalf, and in particular, Mary McCarthy and Lotte Kohler, her personal secretary. And returning to the scene of birth, we know that there was always a woman, the mother, and there are often others too, doing the labor that makes appearance possible. To forget them is to fail to make present, to fail to make appear, those whose presence in the public sphere is disallowed or invisible for a variety of always political reasons. To not understand this is to fail to take Arendt's work on thinking seriously. We might conclude, ironically, with Ali Wong, that lying on her daybed, Arendt embodies the posture that births feminist freedom. It's certainly a better metaphor, at least for our moment, than the leaping newborn.
Thank you, Lori. And I can't help but remind everyone that Passover ended recently, and anybody who's been to the Seder knows that in freedom we recline. And yet nobody ever eats reclining. It's never honored. So maybe next year we'll change that, right? Yeah. Pizza on pillows. Lots of pizza on pillows. Okay. Our concluding paper will be given by Morris Kaplan. He's a professor of philosophy at Purchase College, SUNY, and a frequent visitor at Birkbeck College at the University of London. His work has explored the interstices of private and public life extensively. He's the author of Sexual Justice, Democratic Citizenship and the Politics of Desire, and of Sodom on the Thames, Sex, Love, and Scandal in Wilde, as in Oscar Wilde times. He's currently working on the role of law in Arendt's critique of sovereignty and celebration of political action.
Thank you. I have 4 questions. Before we go
But are you a wise child or a wicked child?
Right. Oh, forgot that. That was I love the photos, and I'm reminded, and I'm sure von Trotte got her idea from this comment in her amazing short piece called Saying Goodbye to Hannah. Mary McCarthy says about Hannah Arendt that she's the only person she knows whom she could watch thinking. And it was when she was reclined on the couch. So I think there is something promising and productive here. The part of what I want to do is to pursue in a slightly different register some of the questions that have already been articulated. And frankly, we didn't talk to each other before setting this up, but it's wonderful for me to see how some of these various perspectives actually converge, and I hope we'll have a lively conversation. I hope everybody has a handout, because my technical facilities stopped with the photocopier. So, to go back to an old-fashioned culture, you may have a handout. And I'm not going to read it to you, but I may refer to it more often than I thought I was going to. In the service of an argument about how to read and think about the textual evidences of Arendt's relentless thinking, what we do. And one of the things that she says in The Life of the Mind about thinking is how different it is from cognition, and that it doesn't actually produce results, or that if it does, tomorrow they may be abandoned in order to start again. That there's a kind of Sisyphean quality of thinking itself that requires us always, or allows us always, to begin again. And one of the things I want to explore a little further is the the way in which throughout Arendt's work there are ambiguities that can be productively probed in ways that have already been suggested by looking much harder at the way the metaphors may actually work, at looking at the few places where she seems to comment in a somewhat different register, and as emerged when we were talking about Eva's paper, some of that really looks a lot like political theology. I mean, a child is born to us, first appears in Isaiah, and then it appears in scriptures. And you may know it from the Messiah, where one of the choruses, unto us a child is born. So the political theology and the horizon of a different kind of thinking sort of creeps in, despite her marvelous secularism in thinking about these issues, her attention to the way in which this is about what kind of world we inhabit and preserve, and in particular, how we confront the phenomenon of newcomers. And I think everybody that has spoken on this panel so far is absolutely right to say there is much more to say about being a newcomer and about the relation between, about the obscuring of the mother and about the relationship between the newcomer and the mother and others who may be in attendance. I tried to suggest in a comment earlier that one of the things that I think hovers here is a passivity on the other side of our capacity to action. And even mothers are born. And that's where the questions about the gift and ultimately perhaps even about creation itself may appear. I'm not going to go too much farther than that, but what I want to do is sustain the argument by looking at some developments in Arendt's thought and try a little bit to historicize and contextualize some of the quotations that we've already heard, but also call attention to others. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't interrupt myself first to say that I've been involved with thinking about Arendt's thinking for a very, very long time. But a very important moment for me was when I undertook, partly as a result of conversations with Bonnie Honig, to write an article for feminist interpretations of Hannah Arendt, and it was called Refiguring the Jewish Question, Arendt, Proust, and the Politics of Sexuality. And there I argued that in thinking about something as apparently private as sexuality, we should look not to the human condition with its various distinctions, but to her treatment of the Jewish question and the production of Jewishness, first as a psychological phenomenon, then as an inherent and ultimately racially inherited identity, how that resulted from contingent historical political operations. And I argued that I started to say that we need to think about that in relation to the status of homosexuality now. And I was talking to Bonnie Honig about it, and I said, well, you really need to look at the origins of totalitarianism again. And of course there I found that Arendt actually makes the point in her reading of Proust, that the homosexual and the Jew in Proust's work are treated as similarly socially marginal phenomena who have both a social and a political status, and that one gets in the way of the other. So what I want to look at in her text are precisely some of these ambiguities. I think, she says about other things, she says about Marx, that the contradictions are often the way into the heart of the thinker. So some people treat some of the stuff I'm about to talk about as contradictions. I want to treat them rather as productive ambiguities that we should examine more fully. And of course, we've already touched on the many modalities in which natality works. The literal, the metaphorical, the descriptive, the need to pluralize what counts as a description of this givenness. And why do I believe that Arendt invites this? Well, the second major piece of writing that Arendt undertook was the Rachel Varnhagen, the story of the life of a German Jewess of the Romantic Age, I think was the full title in German. But what she was, and it's an amazing book, and it looks unlike any other Arendt text, but it clearly was the beginning of her lifelong engagement with the Jewish question. But it wasn't just the Jewish question. One of the things that she quotes from Varnhagen, who is reported to have said when she was dying, that the two things that she thought were the most awful afflictions in her life turned out to be the greatest blessing. And they were being born a Jew and being born a woman. And there it is, right? Clearly the given isn't just given. It has to be received, accepted, taken up, not just at birth, but throughout a lifetime. And I think that Arendt is in a way most revealing of some of her central preoccupations when she touches on what it meant for her to be born an assimilated German Jewish woman in 1906, having studied in university and intending to begin an academic career when in 1933 Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, and she knows it's time to leave, and she leaves philosophy. And I want to recuperate her a little bit for philosophy. It's the liminal spaces, it's the places where she doesn't quite seem to say what she means, and you know there's something else to say. And Lore just now did a very nice job of compressing it. It's that drawing the line between the private and the political is itself political. And it's that ambiguity that I want to probe just a little bit. In the human condition, it goes like this. You can't have action or plurality except within a constituted public realm. That public realm, which is also where democracy, equality, and freedom occur, has been constructed at the beginning in Athens and ever since in one way or another by excluding an enormous number of people from participating in the public realm. So the question then becomes, how did that border get drawn? Is it porous, permeable, semi-permeable? Can it be transformed, fixed, revolutionarily changed? And I think part of the point about Natality is, despite the darkness of life in 20th century Europe, it did not totally eclipse some of these possibilities. Arendt has struck me always as being a thinker for whom democracy is a very, very important notion, even though in what passes for democratic theory, it doesn't get articulated except in a caricatured form. Because the question that she raises and leaves with us is, as I suggest in the little title of these comments, drawing the lines between private and public, which is precisely what Lori called attention to before. And there's another thing that I'm not going to talk much about, which is that these lines are policed, as we know in so many ways. Natality is the capacity of humans to do the new and the unpredictable, to act, to be born. And so that it's a capacity that allows surprises to occur. So let me mention two that pertain to our topic. When I was first asked in the early 1990s what I thought about same-sex marriage, I said, what, are you working on a science fiction project? I mean, what, you know, I don't think this is an interesting question. I'm really more concerned with other issues. It's a fantasy. And I was convinced that I should look at it more closely, and lo and behold, I spent a long time writing about marriage equality, and here we are. Same-sex couples have a constitutional right to marry. That's, for me, a surprise. That's a nice surprise. There's a not-so-nice surprise. In 1965, the most interesting Supreme Court decision I ever read, Griswold versus Connecticut, was about a woman's right not to abortion, but to contraception and information about contraception. And that decision was a lodestone in the cases that led to Roe v. Wade. Without the right to privacy, you don't get there. You can get privacy without a right to abortion, but you can't get to abortion in the constitutional jurisprudence without the right to privacy. Okay, although it was clear that abortion would continue to be contentious, I thought we'd never again hear about rights to contraception until you turn on the news, right? I mean, I'm not recommending that you turn on the news. If you found a way to avoid it, I congratulate you. But the thing that would not surprise Arendt is that these things don't get settled, and that part of democracy is decisions can go your way or the other way, but there is always the possibility of rethinking or beginning again. I'm just going to call attention to some of the quotations that I think help us pursue some of these issues a little bit further out of Arendt. From the beginning, and the beginning of Natality for Arendt is in the most surprising place. It's the conclusions that she wrote in both editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I give you those as the first two quotations on the front page. And she, from the beginning, she's told an incredibly dark story. But at the end, what is she talking about? In the sphere of politics, gratitude emphasizes that we are not alone in the world. We reconcile ourselves to the variety of mankind, to the differences between human beings, only through insight into the tremendous blessedness, right? That man was created with the power of procreation, that not a single man, but men inhabit the earth. All of these quotations include women from the pronomial world, and they were written in the 1950s. We wouldn't, and I don't think she would write them the same way now, but I'm not going to change them. In the second paragraph, we actually have the quotation from Augustine, which is a reflection on unto us a child is given, that a beginning be made, man, think the human, was created. But that's not the end of the story, as we were saying in the discussion earlier. With word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world. And this insertion is like a second birth, in which we confirm, and take upon ourselves the naked fact of our original physical appearance. And there are places where she talks about being born a Jew, being born a woman, being born black, being born white, by extension, is just a naked fact. But the second birth comes with entering the human world. It's how do we take it up? How are we allowed to take it up? And here's where I find Drucilla's notion of the imaginary domain extraordinarily helpful, because this idea of the second birth here really is about becoming a person. And the question is, who gets to decide that, given that there are all sorts of norms to which we're supposed to conform. Action is the political activity par excellence. Natality is the central category of political thought. I am a confirmed bachelor, and I suspected that we would hear a lot about birth. And I thought, well, I have students, and that's got something to do with natality. I'm happy to see a whole bunch of them here. So where did I look? I looked at the essay called The Crisis in Education that's collected in Between Past and Future. And she says actually some quite remarkable things there. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us. The recurrent dilemma of teachers and parents, the kids aren't going to turn out the way you expected. And to start to focus on the interrelationality of the family or the teacher-student relationship or the parent-child relationship is not to enter, a blissful condition. It may be a scene of very, very deep, ongoing, and disturbing conflict. But it's a necessary part of it. And what Arendt does to systematize that is to say, look, the fact that there are newcomers sort of puts the alleged grown-ups in the following actually practical position of trying to figure out how much do they owe the future, that they must preserve the world as it's already been established, and how much is part of the job allowing the newcomers to remake the world the way they want. And I think those people who want to see Arendt as a conservative thinker it's not a very good reading, I don't think. But one of the places I would point to is the essay on civil disobedience, and the idea that political consent, which brings into being something that is beyond the already constituted public domain, because it's what happens in those revolutionary situations where we draw the boundaries or redraw them, and that's an ongoing process. That civil disobedience itself may become a process of remaking constitutional rights and equality. And I think Arendt understands that, and understands that it's difficult for us if we get involved. Either we want to avoid us grown-ups, allow me that. We can get drawn up in wishing to preserve the world as we know it, in which case we're trying desperately to control what the newcomers, the young people, do. Or we can turn the other way and say, well, it's up to them. Student comes to me, what are we going to do about Trump? I don't know, that's your problem, right? I'm already in my 70s, you figure out what to do about it. Or as Hamlet said, final quotation under Natality, the time is out of joint. And she actually goes on to say, the time is always out of joint. The newborn are always cursed or blessed to set it right. I want to shift to laboring very quickly, and I'll wrap up. One of the things that's most troubling for feminists and for me as a queer theorist when I started working with Arendt was what appeared to be the rigid division between private and public, and the downplaying of the social and the intrusion of what she says about it is actually fascinating, that the borders between private and public are eclipsed by the rise of the social. But as Hannah Pitkin actually discovers in the course of her critical engagement with that, that's layering above the notion that what was can be reconfigured. That is, the social can only triumph if there was something else in place and an older order is being transformed. That means the social isn't necessarily there, it may be reconfigured by us. And that's where the borderline, it's odd to think of this, but Arendt requires us to have a kind of democratic conception of a broader horizon of sociality where the borderline between private and public is drawn. And what she says that pertains to our whole conference is everybody, to be free and equal, needs both a protected, sheltered, private space and the capacity to enter the public space. This is where, however, if you really want to think equality in radical ways, this is a very promising way to start. And I think this is, actually meets up with Drucilla's argument, that to talk about democratic rights is to talk about having the capacities to exercise them as they are defined in our world today, and to overcome the obstacles that are always thrown up to the realization of equality. Why do we need both? To live always in the glare of publicity is to become shallow. To live only within the private is not to become fully human. All right. The most interesting quotation that I want you to notice there is under laboring. It's always been, she says, it's the first one under laboring on the front page. It has always been the bodily part, we'll get to bodies, but I'll be very brief about them. It's always been the bodily part of human existence that needed to be hidden in privacy. All things connected with the necessity of the life process, which prior to the modern age comprehended all activities serving the subsistence of the individual and the survival of the species. And now she knows the problem underlying what she's just defined. Hidden away were the laborers who with their bodies minister to the bodily needs of life, and the women who with their bodies guarantee the physical survival of the species. Women and slaves were hidden away not only because they were somebody else's property, not equal citizens, but because their life was laborious, devoted to bodily functions. What does that mean? It means that there is a social duty to enable women to overcome the necessity of the laboring and to provide the help that is required for that to become real, if we're committed to equality. All right, where does the body come into all of this? I'm going to finish up just by suggesting that you look at two places. There's a real denigration of the body that is just hard to avoid in the human condition. I don't know whether she changed her mind or rethought or started reading Merleau-Ponty, but in the beginning of the life of the mind, suddenly the body appears very, very differently. We are a living animal. All animals, according to Arendt, citing Portman, a biologist from the 20s or 30s, have an urge to self-display. Humans have an urge that modifies that self-display by thinking about how we appear to present ourselves. What is it that, I mean, suddenly Arendt is talking about animal behavior and animal bodies, and something we share with all animals. This is a little bit of a surprise. But the mediation is that the human thinks about it. Why? Because we become speaking animals who share the world with others who are different from us. But it's always speech. It's the breath. It's the living quality that we need to have in order to enter a public sphere at all. She has some rich things to say about it. I will just conclude with the final quotation because I love it. And I think it's sort of unexpected. And she was reading, and she actually cites in the footnotes Merleau-Ponty's essay in The Visible and the Invisible on the intertwining. What appears outside is so hopelessly different from the inside that one can hardly say that the inside appears at all. The private has suddenly become the interiority of everybody's body as the kind of animal that we are. And everybody needs that to be protected. The predominance of outside appearance implies, in addition to the sheer receptivity of our senses, a spontaneous activity. Whatever can be seen, whatever can see wants to be seen. Whatever can hear calls out to be heard. Whatever can touch presents itself to be touched. I guess we have to think about the erotics of appearance after all. Thanks.
Thank you, three really amazing openings onto this topic. I have so much by way of questions. Please feel free to just respond to whatever don't feel pressure to respond to everything. But it's hard not to want to introduce all of the great themes that left out. One of them is the attention that was given in all three of your talks to the negotiation of public and private identities, three sort of component parts seem to emerge, right? Our self-understandings, perceptions of others, and then the ascription of formal identities. And it raised the question for me of the integrity, right? That can be what can be held together between those three things, and what's gained for lost by that integrity by politics, including the wrong kinds of politics, and then the lack of politics, or depoliticized understanding of the sort of integration of thought and identity. Is an outstanding assertion of your contribution, Drucilla, was that a person is very fragile in this individuation, right? That it's not given, and that the imaginary domain might be secured as a legal right. And then, Laura, you suggested that this might require both facilitation and then also a certain amount of control or autonomy, right? And that is not, whether it's going to be facilitation or control, and here I'm just speaking from my experience at birth, is not something that can be determined in advance or from the outside, right? It's very much a question of autonomy. You get out of my face now, right? Sometimes. But then I thought you brought these things together, Morris, by reminding us that the trick is that a lot of the time these lines have already been laid down, right? And that we're starting from a deficit. And so the question that then emerges, if the border is always political, it's the problematic piece is that it's also oftentimes given, right? And that we're beginning from a place where we are not setting the terms of debate, right, of where that border is set. And so my question is, I guess, does the assertion of maintenance of privacy or a private realm, the imaginary realm, by right, entail its politicization? And is it possible for it to be the right kind of politics that we're talking about when it's responding already to the wrong kind? When the point has been a priori to exclude people from the public, or to put it in another way, when the world we take up is the world that would not have us, right? So that was my first question. No, I think that was combined 1 and 2, so we're good. Maybe it'll be easier now. The other thing I really wanted to consider was natality as a scene, right, for the imaginary, which I thought was a really felicitous phrase offered to us by Cover's reading of the concept. All three of you problematize, I think, rightly, the denigration of the body, and especially the effacement of dependency and of the mother's body in the scene of birth. I really like this figure that you offered us, Laurie. For the appearance of the new, unsupported leaping is probably the worst posture. And it occurred to me that, again, just speaking from experience, the posture that best facilitates the appearance of the new is a kind of bearing down, right? And the posture that best is going to facilitate bearing down. But the way that reflects is reflected in terms of the encounter with the present other as not sort of the elegant shining forth that we get in Arendt's accounts of action. It's a really ugly vulnerability. You know, it's affect driven, and it opened my thinking on how this is not necessarily untrue of political experience either, right? The ugly vulnerability of childbirth is when we precisely desire the company not of strangers but of intimates, and so I wondered maybe if this might give us another way to think about the kinds of relationality that are required by certain political moments. and how we might think about those borders. And also about how this critique bears on our thinking about the kinds of mirroring that take place in public, and how we might think the political is private. Should we be thinking more carefully about the intimacy that political action requires? Thanks.
Can I start?
Sure.
By answering one question. So I loved your comments. I thought they were really interesting. I just want to say something about this ugly vulnerability, which I like the way that you put that, and link that up with something that Morris was saying about Rahel. And I was thinking about that quote that you read, Morris, about we confirm and take upon ourselves the naked fact of our original physical appearance, that one from the Human Condition. And I was thinking about that in terms of Rahel, and how at the end of Rahel Varnhagen, after giving like a wonderful account of the reasons that Rahel could not approach the world, that she couldn't make her way into the world, Arendt says at the end that the way that she would have made herself made it possible for her to have worldliness, as it were, was to, as you so rightly said, to acknowledge the fact that she was a Jew and a woman. But that is weird to me. I was thinking about that when you were saying that, because how does she get into the world by acknowledging this naked fact, which is never a naked fact, right? Because it's a political fact to be both a Jew and a woman. And and also Arendt in Rahel had said that the way that Rahel had tried to get into the world was through marriage and through love. So those forms of sociality that were only available to women, that was their only approach to the world and only available to Rahel. And I was thinking, so I'm just like thinking out loud here, but I was thinking about that ugly vulnerability, and to me it wasn't that she needed the help of intimates, like her husband, although that is how she got into the world, like her husband and her lovers, that was the help of intimates. But actually, I think she needed the help of strangers, which brings me back to the point about the ugly vulnerability and who you turn to. Like, I don't think everyone does want intimates. In my experience, I wanted strangers. It was like the nurse in the room was so much better than anybody I could have ever imagined. I was like, give me a professional who can, whatever. So strangers can help us, even in those private spaces. And Rahel could have been helped by strangers. She could have been helped by other women. And not, because she certainly wasn't helped by her intimates. And so, I don't know. So I was just thinking about the relationality there in terms of like what makes it possible for action. I mean, this goes back a little bit to Eva's wonderful keynote this morning or earlier today. Like, what makes it possible to think natality and the fact of natality and those givenness, along with what Linda had said about natality is about the birth and that metaphor of birth, but it's also about action. What can make it into action? And who do we do action with? And I feel like it is with intimates, but it's also with strangers. And that just, made that connection with Rahel there. So,
if I can just jump in here, I think part of the problem is the way that we in the United States and certainly in Europe think about strangers and intimates. I can't resist talking a little bit about Ubuntu here. The idea is that we are in an affective chain from the time that our umbilical cord is buried and we're entered into a human community, and in a certain sense, no human is a stranger. Now this leads to all sorts of legal conclusions that you do not have in Roman law or in Anglo-American law. For instance, it is seen as a crime if you don't rescue a so-called stranger because they're a human being and they're in an effective chain. And if you don't rescue someone, we only have duty to rescue if they're in your immediate family. And so the idea of that line itself denies the fact that we are in an affective chain and that everything I do affects you. So if women are fundamentally excluded from the public world, that completely defines who a man is. and what a man is. And so there's no plurality, there's no surprises, and the whole attempt at heteronormative policing is to keep those surprises from happening. And so that the erotic life then becomes something that is totally foreclosed, and that's what it means to think about transindividuality as being an affective chain. If we hear somebody yelling outside and none of us get up and do anything about it, it will affect not only everything at BART, it will affect everything in New York City, it will affect relations in St. Louis, because we aren't divided neatly into intimates and strangers. And the nurse that was kind to you and good to you became somebody, I'm sure, who wasn't a stranger. We all know what it's like to go to a doctor and have the doctor be a stranger. Boy, is that horrible. So I think that's part of the discourse of Hannah Arendt is caught up in a certain kind of European, Anglo-American notion of the individual that leads her to reach out for something that she can't quite grasp.
Oh, I agree that she can't quite grasp it. I think, just a couple comments, the lesson that she drew from the case of Rahel Varnhagen was that the Jews of Europe, after they were liberated, emancipated, given some legal rights, had failed before and continued to fail to realize that they had a political problem.
Right.
They tried to look for social solutions, marry right, assimilate, learn to, use your education to advance in civil society. But that the underlying question of being recognized as an individual was underplayed. And of course, if we reread the Varnhagen story through the eyes of contemporary feminism and real egalitarianism, we want to say, yeah, and look at all the other barriers that she faced because she was a woman who wasn't liberated and didn't have rights. And I think this goes to Dawn's question about the obstacles to reaching to becoming a person that the world presents us, and how they get defined will be what counts as an obstacle will be defined and redefined. So I don't know for sure what the next major issue is and how they're going to be redefined, but that they will be redefined and that there will be real resistance to that is something that we need to register. That to say that it is in the broader sense of political is to say it's going to be contentious and conflictual. And look, she's writing about revolution, and after she wrote that, she did the civil disobedience piece, and then a piece on violence. I mean, we know, I hope, that many of the norms that all of us on the panel seem to agree in challenging are enforced rigorously and violently in many different contexts. And the question is, well, how do you need to become violent to transform them? And I don't know. There's another piece that Arendt, I think, helps with that underlies a lot of our concerns. One of the things that she says, and it takes us back to the body, but also to the public, we're talking about embodied situations in the world. And so to talk about privacy is not just to talk about rights, but it's to talk about having the ability to create a space where you can keep strangers and the state and a whole bunch of people out. And it's interesting, the first time I gave a public talk about Arendt and the Jewish question and gay rights, the commentator, who was totally baffled by everything, said, well, he didn't think Hannah Arendt would agree that same-sex couples should marry. I said, well, that's not quite the point. But what is the point, and can Arendt help? Sure she can. In the very controversial reflections on Little Rock, where she's very, very ambivalent about the early stage of the civil rights movement and about focusing on desegregating schools, and that this sacrificed and prematurely politicized young black children. But before she gets to that, she says, look, in 20-some states, white people and black people cannot marry. That's the issue for her. And it's not just, it is partly equal protection and so on, but it's also who had the right to decide with whom they are going to create and share a space in the world that will be theirs and not somebody else's, and that will impose on the strangers the obligation to recognize that space. So her attack on the laws that prohibit miscegenation, it grew out of her own experience. By 1935, Jews and Gentiles couldn't marry in Nazi Germany. One of the shameful chapters about which a Yale law professor has just written a book is that the Nuremberg laws that prohibited that were based on American laws in the South, that Jim Crow laws that prohibited black people and white people from marrying. So the Nazis knew where to look. It was not, as some of you who might not know, it wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court overturned the anti-miscegenation laws. I mean, there's a film about, it's the best named case in Supreme Court history. It's called
Loving Virginia.
People Against Loving. Yeah. I mean, the Loving was the name of the couple that challenged it, the interracial couple. There it is, and that's right. but that was 1967. The Brown versus Board of Education was in the 50s. So it took time to catch up. But I think Arendt understood something really profound here, that to be in the world as an equal, you really need that private place. And in our world, that's made through marrying. So everybody ought to be able to marry with the person who chooses them. Right? It shouldn't be up to the state to preclude that. I think that's very important. Final comment, which also goes to the depth that the constraints may be. Drucilla wrote an amazing piece in an otherwise not very interesting book called Feminist Contentions. It was interesting at the time, but a lot of it stayed, except for Drucilla's piece, which addressed the question, what is ethical feminism, and why should feminists read Lacan? And the answer was, you should read Lacan because the resistance to equality is that deep. It's inscribed in the culture, in society, and in our own unconscious. In her amazing piece, The Arendtian Body, Linda points out that, writing about the body, she found herself the female body in Linda's body, and then she quoted Lacan, who says, well, initially there's the choice, it's a boy or it's a girl. You go into a male or female designated bathroom. Do you? What does the state have to do with it? If anything is private, wouldn't you think it's toilets? We have a big public issue about the access of trans people to bathrooms and which one they're supposed to choose. That too it's deep, and the resistance, you wonder, why is this, why do people get so excited about it? So that they resist, and the answer is it challenges that binary that structures not only our thinking, but our unconscious as well. So it ain't going to be easy, and it's all about allowing contention to flourish.
Yeah, I just want to make one last comment, which is on responsibility, because, and this gets back again to the distinction between strangers and intimates. I wrote in the first conference that Roger held pretty, I thought, scathing critique of Hannah Arendt's view of the young black children who parents were being irresponsible to have them go into what was one of the world's ugliest forms of whiteness that I have ever seen. It was white people as monsters. What Arendt missed was the responsibility of white people to stand up and be with those students.
Yeah.
At that time, I volunteered to be bused to an all-black high school because the only way to end whiteness is monstrosity. For those of you who have not seen the movie Get Out, I highly recommend it to you because this is whiteness as I knew it. A bunch of monsters who were trying to grab white bodies. So responsibility here. At the time, Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin asked John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, to walk with those children. And he refused. If the President of the United States had walked with those children, the white people, who are a bunch of cowards, would have immediately been in a different situation. We don't know some of those facts. So really, one of the things that I think that sometimes Arendt doesn't get, okay, fine, we can have contention, is that integration in the schools never happened. Busing never happened. And that wasn't inevitable. It was because white people did not step up and say, I am not a monster. I accept my responsibility for racism in this country, and I will get on a bus and go to an all-black school. I was sent to a psychiatrist by my parents for volunteering to be bused. But the notion that it's just contention, there's also a huge ethical demand on us.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, there's when she's trying to find her way out of the origins of totalitarianism, and starts talking about the need for really recognizing a human right to have rights, and that this pertains to every human, regardless of race and gender and everything else. She's reaching out for it, and she doesn't. She imagines world government doesn't solve things, but what she talks about is that responsibility to all other humans for the world. And she says, we're not really going to have regimes of human rights until people take on themselves their responsibility for everybody else with whom they share the world. That's a big ethical demand.
I can't resist noting how the fact that you were sent to a psychiatrist by your parents really crystallizes that tension between self-understanding, perceptions of others, and formal descriptions in the context of meeting an ethical demand. That's really... questions?
So I looked at all of these papers, and my question's kind of inspired by, I guess, two things that were consistently brought up. Whether the scene of natality is public or private, and then the repeated references to Lacan, because this is like totally weird, but I'm thinking of the debates in France in the 90s over the bioethics laws. So gay marriage is never, was like very, very late problem in France, but the problem was always medically assisted procreation among gay couples in France. It was not marriage or even just reproduction, but specifically reproduction by gays has become a constant crisis point. And so what happens is you have deputies in the lower house of parliament in France holding up copies of Lacan and Levi Strauss, elementary forms of kinship, being like, they teach us that if you have gay reproduction, we will have psychosis because it will be symbolic disintegration, and Lacan taught us that proper socialization requires going through the symbolic, and we all know that symbolic means a mother and a father. And so an argument that is based on many of the things we've talked about, the fragility of realizing personhood, the conditions of individuation, and the publicness of reproduction are weaponized in uneven ways. On one hand, a promotion of familialism in France, but against familialism by gays, precisely because then whatever France will decay because then gays will have families. And so I'm interested in the ways in which, so this gets to a larger concern of Arendt gives us a very formalist understanding of politics, but the level of content it often backfires. I'm kind of interested in us thinking about those backfiring moments in which we can acknowledge many of the things that we've just talked about, and then it cuts exactly the opposite way in which we might intuitively think it does. So whether you all might think about whether we might think more strategically about whether we want to consider something like natality a public scene or a private scene, or whether the kinds of contextual considerations that we have to take into mind, whether we choose to portray the scene of natality as public, or really a birth.
I mean, I have a simple answer to that, Kevin, which probably won't satisfy you, but I guess for me the question wouldn't be whether the scene of natality is public or private, but how it is public and how it is private, right? And so that is what we need to pay attention to, how that line is drawn. And then we won't be surprised by the state weaponizing it against certain individuals. I mean, the state can be a really terrible force that defines marriage in terms that are limiting. I mean, speaking of the Loving case, I mean, Arendt also talks about this in Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she talks about the state of Israel doing the exact same thing in terms of defining who can marry whom and what will be good for the state of Israel in terms of marriage politics. So, I mean, these private scenes, these scenes that are presumably most intimate, between intimates, are always in relationship to state power. I mean, they just obviously are, right? So, so that, I think, is what we need to focus on, and I think that Arendt helps us do that. That is what I was trying to get to at the end of my comments. I mean, I think that Arendt helps us do that in the way that Linda has pointed out so well in terms of questions of thinking and judgment. And that is where we understand, and so Linda might not agree with what I said about private and public, but I would say that she, by bringing those objects into view for debate and contestation in a way where there are no rules or final answers, but allow us to sort of work in the space of political plurality to see those kinds of things that we formerly could not see because they seemed private. And again, that's like the point about Lacan, for example, or Levi-Strauss, right? I mean, like that, even the symbolic, like, I don't know, maybe you would answer this differently, Giselle, but I think those are political kinds of questions. And we want to ask how they're political.
I think that's right. Just a very quick comment, which is that Levi-Strauss, who was very old when that was happening, actually went public to say that this was not what his own understanding of the symbolic required. There was no reason in the world why same-sex couples couldn't adopt and bring up perfectly healthy children. But it is another scene of contention, and it's not like we can keep, we may imagine a world where these are private matters that people decide voluntarily between themselves. Oh, you want to have a kid together? Yeah, let's do it. Bring it up, or let's adopt a kid. But the law is always already entangled with these matters. So I just want to underline Laurie's point. It is really a question of how we deal with the publicity of the private, and it may be through the court. I mean, there is another issue about the relationship between courts that adjudicate controversies over who has a right to what, and democratic politics, where things are rather more profoundly and extensively and heatedly contested. And that's a question for, that's another question, but it's one we can't avoid on the other side of this kind of discussion, I think.
No, I think it's a really important question. And I think there's kind of a hidden element to this debate, which is, can you expect constitutions that seek to live up to ideals to settle certain questions to some degree? And, of course, it can always be contested. We're about ready to lose the right to contraception and the right to abortion. But we're also losing the notion of an independent Supreme Court, and we're losing a notion of the entire structure of the Constitution. So, and I think that's important to note, because we're getting into real,
by the way,
we're getting into real trouble. That one of the goals of the Constitution is to say that certain questions will not have to be rehearsed again and again and again and again. And I think this is particularly important because if you think that everything is up for, I'm not in this sense a certain kind of radical Democrat where all we do is contest and fight and contest and fight. I'm a believer in winning victories. And when you win a victory, you celebrate it and you stand on it and you say, yes, it's a better world, absolutely better world because women have the right to abortion. Yes, it's a better world that blacks and whites can get married, but the truth of the matter is the horrific racism of this society has not ever been effectively constitutionally challenged. And so I think that in a certain sense, the answer isn't just that everything must be contended. And I agree with you, the closest she comes to ethical responsibility is at the end of on totalitarianism. But that also turns on the idea that we can and must be better, and that we can actually think about what is better. As part of democratic theory, as it sometimes gets practiced, is that everything is equally as good. Well, I just think that's crazy. I really do. I mean, the whole point of political theory is to put out ideals and defend them. And those ideals can be defended through judgment as better or worse, and fought for as better or worse. And that's why Arendt said judgment is going. And a lot of academic political theory throws out judgment because we resist, of course not them, other people for the most part resist and get their shit kicked out of them. Even in the pornography debate, what was the solution? There was all this debate about legal regulation of pornography. Well, there was a woman out there organizing women and men into unions, and her demand was all condom sets. And the porn industry said then it wouldn't be porn anymore because porn was defined as an ejaculation. Women, whatever they were doing, it was fiddling around. But when sex is serious, and that's when you have a penis, and that's when you have an ejaculation, and that's porn. So if you have condoms, then the whole porn industry is destroyed, according to these guys who were big First Amendment absolutists. So I use this as an example, is that there are people always fighting for ideals, and all condom sets is an ideal. And she wanted to win it because young people were dying of AIDS. So, the purpose of fighting isn't just to fight and resist and contest. And usually the people who think that are people who've never been activists, because we don't want to just fight and contest, fight and contest, fight and contest. And the people who argued against labor law, which we've all lost now, we don't have any rights anymore, but we used to have them when I was a union organizer. Well, it's a big loss that we lost those labor law rights. But they said, oh, well, you can always go on a wildcat strike. Have you ever tried to go on a wildcat strike when you don't have a strike fund? And people are losing their cars and their houses and they can't send their kids to school with any kind of food? No, this resist, contest, I think we need to put in the context of A, constitutional ideals and the fact that certain things can be settled, and thank God, even though they're not being settled now, they're being unsettled. And secondly, that unsettling should have everybody out in the streets constantly, and that we fight when we fight to win, and to have ideals, and define them, and say, okay, we have won this now.
The only thing that I would add, that Arendt reminds us, is that if we win, there's no guarantee that that's the end of the story once and for all. I mean, the whole point of Natality is the monsters, in case, well, I guess we're taking this for granted, the monsters are back. They're in the cabinet, they're in the Congress, they're all over the place. We thought we won. There's no guarantee, there is no guarantee that our victory will survive the next 4 years. And you know this because you're pointing to all the areas that are at risk. Arendt says that to enter the political domain, the eminently political virtue is courage. Because to fight to win is also to risk losing. And you don't win once and for all. The struggle is renewed.
We have 5 minutes left. So can I take a couple of questions and then we'll get to the responses? Okay. Yeah.
So I just want to throw in lovely panel. One more thing to this marvelous, how the line between private and political is drawn, not to forget what I find still problematic but incredibly rich in Arendt, that line is coupled with the violent distribution of politics and labor, or action and labor. And she explicitly says it's violent. It was violent imposition by political means this of labor on slaves and women. Capitalism is violent, so that the few have the privilege of politics. And doing manual labor, as I've done and worked in the fields, you know that you are so bodily exhausted at the end that you cannot have any capacity for anything. So for me, that's a very important insight, that private and political is coupled with the distribution, violent redistribution of this most heart-breaking and back-breaking labor.
Other questions, Linda?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I had two questions, one for Drucilla and one for Lori. So the one for Lori is that it's, I don't disagree with your characterization.
Can you just speak up a little bit?
Yeah, I don't disagree with Lori's characterization of what's missing, let's say, in Arendt's account of the child and the mother's sort of. But this is exactly why I don't want to read natality in terms of birth. Because I think the minute you do that, it's just all over. I mean, there's so many things she doesn't say that she would need to say. And that's why I think we need to have a political reading of natality as action rather than as birth. All right, so the other point is just that well, let me go to Drucilla, because I know we don't have a lot of time. So Drucilla, I love what you're doing, you know, I always have, and I think my question is this, it has to do with the imaginary domain in Lacan, and I don't mean this so much as a Lacan type scholar issue, because I'm no Lacan scholar, but I mean, my understanding of the imaginary is that it's a fully delusional state, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the imaginary. And so consequently, this whole argument against ego psychology, it was, you know, based on building up the ego, which is built in relation to the imaginary. That's exactly what he's fighting against. And so his argument about where is any kind of rupture going to come from, well, it's the unconscious, you know, it's not going to come from the imaginary. The reason I'm bringing up this point is because I think if you use the term imaginary in a non-Lacanian sense, like a Castoridian sense, or some of Cordius Castoriadis, or some, or Irigaray, or someone, you know, who's sort of kind of prying it away from Lacan, then it makes more sense to me in terms of what you're trying to do. The reason I think it's important is because what I hear you as trying to do is, you know, on the one hand, you're insisting on the importance of individuality, but without sovereignty. Right? This is kind of the key thing, because you're making this link also with your South African examples, and the rest is that, you know, we're embedded, we're in this chain of affect, as you put it, etc. But that, not a but, I just think that this has always been one of the most difficult things for feminism, is how do you insist on, for example, bodily integrity and all the rest, right? The right to reproductive freedom and all the rest, without reinscribing a language of sovereignty. Because without reinscribing a language of sovereignty, right? I mean, sovereignty.
Individual sovereignty.
Yeah, you know, I mean, because that's the way in which the body and the rest is normally defended within liberal law. So that's clearly not what you want to argue, and it's not, I think, what most feminists, well, certainly here would want to argue, but I think feminism generally has gotten entangled in the problematic of sovereignty precisely for this reason.
The whole idea of the imaginary domain was to struggle through that problem and find what was value in privacy. And so the need to do that meant two things. First, we had to completely understand that what we think of as individuality and personality is actually a process of individuation that can be destroyed. And you can get this because it is an idea of practical reason, not just from Lacan, but from almost any psychology you picked up. So in that way, it's precisely because we can't exercise sovereignty, but that's a phallic myth, that we need the imaginary domain. And for me, the problem with this in private spaces to retreat was that, I mean, what was the value there in terms of like trying to work out primary identifications? And of course it turned a lot on private property. And as an old socialist, of course, I've read all of the architectural experiments in the first 2 years of the socialist revolution. Yes, they went too far in not allowing people to have individual apartments, but they also had collective kitchens. They also had ways that people could live together in public and private in the same apartment building. So one of the things I was struggling to articulate is we can never have phallic sovereignty. That's the fantasy. So ironically, we need this imaginary domain to have this space in which, and it's not literal, it's metaphoric, to have this space in which we can come to terms with our identification. And they are fundamentally blocked, this is kind of a Spinoza point, in terms of the imagination, by barriers to allowing us to have complex lives. So the imaginary domain is meant to move against the barriers. It's also meant to, and this is where you're hearing the sovereignty, to give to the person the infinite right to re-narrate, reimagine who they are in their sexual being or in their racial identifications, which of course gets completely blocked in racism if you have no access to schools. And I think it's important to see it then as trying to work with what if we turned the whole notion of sovereignty on its head and said it's precisely because we cannot have it that we need the imaginary domain. And that this becomes particularly important when you think of the proliferation of ways of expressing sexual difference, sexuality, and I would argue, this goes to all other forms of primary identification. So that would be my answer. On the other hand, I've been getting back to those great socialist experiments in the first 2 years of the Soviet Union. The other part of this is understanding, like in your example of what does it mean to be a woman and a Jew when you have no access to personhood, is that you can be effectively blocked and shattered to the point that you can't even imagine it. That's Spinoza's point. Complexities rob you. You can't even imagine what it would mean to be a woman in the public realm. Like every woman in this room, we're all affirmative action appointments. I'm literally an affirmative action appointment because African-American man sued and the University of Pennsylvania had to hire 4 women, one of which was me. So I'm literally an affirmative action appointment, but you're all affirmative action appointment. As when Sandra O'Connor got out of law school, she thought she'd be a legal secretary. That's Spinoza's point. When you live in a world where you're completely blocked, your imagination is completely blocked. She ended up as Supreme Court Justice. But when she was 35, she said, I couldn't even imagine it. So that's why I came up with this ideal, an aesthetic idea of the imaginary domain as a way of valuing individuation, of valuing one aspect at least of privacy, but would not go against people who want to act out in public. So, gay pride parades and all the rest. So that's why I've always been uncomfortable with this notion of retreat. Where are we retreating into? Lonely little apartments in New York City, if you have a chance to actually rent an apartment. I mean, it's so tied in with private property, right? You get to keep everybody out, and then you're all alone at night. So big deal. So some of the reworking of the public and private is going to also mean reworking the whole architecture of how we live.
One
Can I
That's
just-
sentence.
that's beyond the imaginary domain form.
Can I just quickly answer, Linda? I just want to quickly answer you, Linda. I agree with you that if you really only read natality as birth in Arendt, it's just going to be a lacking account, and we're just going to get the tried and true feminist criticisms of Arendt that we know so well. But what I was trying to do instead is think about natality, birth as a metaphor. So in natality as a metaphor, it is both birth and action. So in that metaphor, I wanted to ask, and that's what I was trying to do, is to ask, what does action look like in that metaphor? So I was actually far more interested in the question of action than in the question of birth. But I think they're absolutely intertwined in that metaphor of natality for Arendt. And so it leads to a question about what does action and what do freedom look like in Arendt, and what are we thinking about when we think about natality as metaphor there?
But how is birth action? I can see how it's labor in the way that, what Drucilla was objecting to earlier on,
Yeah.
but am I supposed to stop?
I'm gonna be courageous here. My role as the moderator of this panel and say, you're up, yeah, I have to
Yeah.
it's great pain to stop it, but can we table the thought for the round table that we'll have after
Take
we
a
talk?
5-minute break.
Okay, yeah.
Can I do one sentence? We can't give up on the claim to literal and not just metaphoric space.
Right. That's why